I quit nursing 3 months ago, packed up everything I owned, and moved clear across the country to Florida. My family thinks I had some kind of breakdown after my divorce, but that's not the truth. The truth is what happened during those night shifts at Pine Ridge Regional Hospital in Oregon. I've never told anyone this story before, but I can't carry it alone anymore. My name is Sarah Chen, and for 3 years, I worked as an ICU nurse at Pine Ridge Regional. It's one of those hospitals you'd drive right past if you didn't know it was there. A squat, concrete building from the 1960s, surrounded by towering pine trees, about 40 miles outside of Portland. The kind of place that serves logging towns and rural communities scattered across those dark Oregon forests. After my divorce, I needed extra money. The lawyer fees, splitting assets, starting over, it all adds up fast. So when they offered me additional night shifts at time-and-a-half pay, I jumped at the chance. Night shift at Pine Ridge ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and during those hours, the hospital felt like a completely different world. The building had 4 floors. Ground floor was emergency and admitting. Second floor was general medicine. Third floor was ICU, where I normally worked. And the 4th floor, well, that's where this story really begins. The 4th floor used to be the pediatric wing, 20-bed unit that served sick children from all across our rural county. But in October, just before I started picking up those night shifts, administration announced they were closing pediatrics due to budget cuts. All the children were transferred to Portland, and the entire wing was shut down. My first night on the new assignment, the charge nurse, Rita, handed me a set of keys I'd never seen before. "You'll be doing security rounds on 4, she said, not meeting my eyes. "Every 2 hours. Just walk through, make sure everything's locked up tight, check that the equipment isn't running." I asked her why they needed a nurse to do security rounds, and she just shrugged. "Hospital policy. Can't leave a whole floor unmonitored, even if it's empty." That first night, I took the elevator to the 4th floor at midnight. The doors opened into complete darkness. The hallway stretched out in both directions, lit only by those red exit signs and the pale glow from the nurses' station. My footsteps echoed off the polished floors as I walked past room after room of empty beds. The pediatric wing had that particular hospital smell. Disinfectant, mixed with something else. Something sweet and sad that I could never quite identify. But that night, there was another scent underneath it all. Something cold and stale, like air that hadn't moved in years. I did my rounds methodically, checked each room, tested door handles, made notes on my clipboard. Most of the medical equipment had been moved out, but some things remained. 4 poles stood like metal skeletons in corners. A few monitors sat covered with dust sheets. In the playroom, toys were still scattered across the floor. Blocks and stuffed animals and picture books, as if the children had just stepped out for a moment. About halfway through my rounds, I noticed the temperature seemed to drop. I mean, really drop. Like someone had opened a window in the middle of October. I checked the thermostat in the hallway. It read 72 degrees, same as the rest of the hospital. But my breath was starting to fog. Then the lights began to flicker. Not all at once, but in sequence, like a wave rolling down the corridor. I stood there watching this happen, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Old building, probably electrical issues. Maybe they were doing maintenance work somewhere, and it was affecting the power grid. But then I heard something that made my blood freeze. Beep. 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 The sound was coming from room 418, about 20 feet ahead of me. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. I walked toward the sound, my keys jangling in my suddenly sweaty palm. The door to 418 was closed, but that beeping was definitely coming from inside. I opened the door and hit the light switch. The room was empty, just like all the others. No equipment, no monitors, nothing that could make that sound. But as soon as the lights came on, the beeping stopped. I stood there for probably 5 minutes, listening to nothing but my own heartbeat and the whisper of air through the vents. Finally, I convinced myself it had been sound, carrying from another floor, maybe an ICU monitor 3 flights down. Hospitals are weird with acoustics. The rest of that first shift passed without incident. I completed my rounds every 2 hours, noted everything as normal, and by 7 a.m., I was ready to write the whole thing off as first night jitters. But the second week, things started getting worse. It was a Tuesday night, around 2 a.m. I was taking the elevator up for my midnight rounds when it stopped at the 4th floor without me pressing the button. The doors slid open to that familiar darkness, and I just stood there, staring down the empty hallway. I pressed the close button. Nothing happened. Pressed it again. Harder. The doors stayed open. Fine, I thought. I'll do the rounds now instead of waiting until 2:30. I stepped off the elevator and immediately felt that bone-deep cold. But this time, it wasn't just the temperature. This time, I could hear voices. Children's voices. Faint. Like they were coming from very far away, but definitely there. I couldn't make out words, just the soft rise and fall of conversation. Multiple voices, maybe 4 or 5 kids, talking and occasionally laughing. It sounded like they were playing some kind of game. I followed the sound down the main corridor, past the nurses' station, toward the family room at the far end of the wing. With each step, the voices got a little clearer, a little more real. I could almost make out what they were saying. Your turn, Emma. Don't forget the rules. I don't want to play anymore. I want to go home. You can't go home yet. None of us can. I reached the family room and pressed my ear to the door. The voices were definitely coming from inside. But when I opened the door and flicked on the lights, the room was empty. Not just empty, completely silent, like sound itself had been sucked out of the air. I backed out of the room and closed the door, my hands shaking. That's when I noticed the elevator had left. The call button was lit up red, indicating it was on another floor. I was stranded up there until it came back. While I waited, I decided to check out the nurses' station. Maybe there were some old records, something that could explain what I was experiencing. The drawers were mostly empty, but in the bottom drawer of the medication cart, I found a stack of patient files that had been left behind. I shouldn't have looked through them. Patient confidentiality and all that. But I was scared and confused, and I needed answers. The files were all from the 1980s. Children who had been patients on the 4th floor, kids with cancer and heart defects and rare genetic disorders. As I flipped through the records, I started noticing a pattern. Too many of these children had died. Not just died under strange circumstances. Sudden cardiac arrest in previously stable patients. Respiratory failure in children who were recovering well. Unexplained complications that led to rapid decline and death. One file made me stop cold. A little girl named Emma Patterson, age 7, admitted in March 1987 for treatment of leukemia. According to her chart, she had been responding well to chemotherapy. Her white cell count was improving. Her energy was returning. The nurse's notes described her as bright and playful, looking forward to going home. But then something changed. The final entries, written in different handwriting, told a different story. Emma became withdrawn and fearful. She told nurses that the doctor was doing bad things during his nighttime visits. She begged not to be left alone with him. 3 days later, Emma Patterson died of sudden heart failure. I was reading through more files when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside the nurses' station. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone trying to be quiet. I stuffed the files back in the drawer and grabbed my flashlight. "Hello," I called out. "Security." The footsteps stopped. I walked out into the hallway and shone my light in both directions. Nothing. But as I turned to go back to the elevator, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Wet footprints on the polished floor. Small footprints, like a child's bare feet. They led from the family room down the main corridor, past the nurse's station, and disappeared around the corner toward the patient rooms. I followed them, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. The footprints were fading as I watched, the water evaporating or soaking into the floor. By the time I reached room 418, the same room where I'd heard the heart monitor that first night, they were almost gone. The door to 418 was standing open. I was certain I had closed it during my previous rounds. Certain. But there it was, hanging open like an invitation. Or a trap. I approached slowly, my flashlight held out in front of me like a weapon. Inside the room, I could see the outline of an empty hospital bed, a chair, a small table. Nothing unusual. But as I got closer, I realized the room wasn't empty after all. There was a little girl sitting on the bed. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, with dark hair and pale skin. She was wearing a hospital gown that looked decades out of date, and she was staring directly at me, with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "Are you Emma?" I whispered. The girl nodded slowly. When she spoke, her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "He heard us. The doctor. He did things to us when we were sleeping." My flashlight began to flicker, and in the intermittent light, I could see other children peering in the room. 4, 5, 6 small figures sitting on the bed, standing in corners, gathered around the little table, all of them in hospital gowns, all of them staring at me with those ancient, knowing eyes. "We tried to tell," another voice said, this one from a boy who couldn't have been older than 5. "But nobody listened. They said we were making it up because we were scared." The temperature in the room was dropping rapidly. I could see my breath now, and frost was beginning to form on the windows. My flashlight died completely, leaving us in darkness, except for the pale light filtering in from the hallway. "We can't leave," Emma said. "Not until someone knows what really happened. Not until someone stops him from hurting other children." "But the wing is closed," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "There are no more children here. He's still here. He never left. He's waiting for them to reopen the wing, waiting for new children to hurt." The lights in the hallway began to flicker, and I could hear that sound again, the heart monitor beeping faster and faster, like a child in distress. Other sounds joined it, ventilators whooshing, IV pumps clicking, the soft whisper of children crying. That's when I saw him. Standing in the doorway, backlit by the flickering hallway lights, was a tall figure in a white coat. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his attention focused on me like a physical weight. The children in the room began to whimper and draw back, clustering together on the bed. "He knows you've seen us," Emma whispered. "He knows you have the files." I backed against the far wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the doorway began to move forward, and I caught a glimpse of his face in the strobing light. Gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that reflected, light like an animal's. But then the elevator chimed, and I heard voices, real voices, coming from the hallway. The night security guard was calling my name, asking if everything was all right up there. When I looked back at the doorway, the figure was gone. When I looked at the bed, the children were gone too. I was alone in an empty room, shaking and gasping and trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. The security guard found me there 5 minutes later. His name was Frank, and he'd been working at Pine Ridge for 15 years. When I tried to explain what I'd seen, he just nodded grimly. "You found the files, didn't you?" he said. I nodded, still too shaken to speak. "Dr. Nathaniel Morse," Frank continued. Worked here from 1985 to 1988. Pediatric specialist. Families started asking questions about their children's treatment, about unexplained deterioration in previously stable patients. Administration launched an investigation, but before they could conclude it, Morse died in a car accident on Highway 26. What did they find? I asked. Frank was quiet for a long moment. They found evidence that he was conducting unauthorized medical experiments on terminally ill children, using their desperation against them, promising miracle cures that didn't exist. Most of the children he treated died, but not from their diseases. They died from what he did to them. Why didn't anyone report it? Why wasn't there a criminal investigation? There was, but it died with Morse. The hospital administration wanted to keep it quiet to avoid lawsuits and bad publicity. The families were told their children died from complications related to their illnesses. The truth was buried with the victims. I thought about those children, trapped on the 4th floor for over 30 years, trying to tell their story to anyone who would listen. What about the wing closure? I asked. Was that really about budget cuts? Frank shook his head. The night staff started reporting incidents about 6 months ago. Voices, cold spots, equipment turning on by itself. 3 nurses quit before you started. Administration decided it was easier to close the wing than deal with whatever was happening up there. That was my last night at Pine Ridge Regional Hospital. I submitted my resignation the next morning, packed my apartment, and drove straight to Florida without looking back. But before I left, I did one more thing. I made copies of those files and sent them anonymously to the county prosecutor's office, along with a detailed letter explaining what I had found. 6 months later, I read in the news that Pine Ridge Regional Hospital was under investigation for historical medical malpractice. 3 weeks after that, the hospital closed permanently. I don't know if the children found peace after the truth came out. I like to think they did. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up to the sound of heart monitors beeping and small voices whispering in the darkness. And I remember Emma Patterson's words. We can't leave until someone knows what really happened. Well, now you know. And maybe that's enough. If you're still listening to this story, you probably understand why some truths need to be shared, even when they're terrifying. A like or comment helps keep stories like this alive. And honestly, sharing the fear makes it a little easier to bear. This happened to me 2 years ago, and I still drive 20 miles out of my way to avoid passing that place. I haven't told this story to anyone. Not my ex-wife, not my therapist, not even my kids. But I need to get it out, because keeping it inside is killing me slowly. My name is Marcus Williams, and I used to work overnight security at the Millfield shopping center in Indiana. I took that job because I needed steady work that wouldn't interfere with my custody schedule. My divorce had gone badly. I was living in a 1-bedroom apartment, and I had 2 kids depending on me to get my life together. Millfield Shopping Center was one of those malls that time forgot. Built in the late 70s during the shopping mall boom, it had been slowly dying for the past decade. When I started working there, maybe 10 stores were still open, scattered across 2 floors like teeth in an old man's mouth. The rest were empty storefronts with metal gates pulled down and for lease signs gathering dust. The mall management hired me for overnight security because of my military background. 8 years as an MP in the Army before I came back home to Indiana. They figured I could handle being alone in a big empty building all night. What they didn't tell me was why the previous security guard had quit without notice. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. The job was simple enough. Walk the perimeters every 2 hours, check that all the store gates were locked, make sure nobody was trying to break in or camp out in the corridors. The mall had a decent security system, but management wanted human eyes on the property. The first few weeks went fine. I'd bring a book, listen to podcasts, walk my rounds. The mall at night had an eerie quality. All those empty storefronts and dead fountains, escalators that ran on timers, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the high ceilings. But eerie isn't scary. I'd seen worse things in Afghanistan. It was sometime in my third week that I started noticing the sounds. At first, I thought it was the building settling, or maybe the HVX system cycling on and off. But gradually, I realized I was hearing voices, distant, muffled conversations that seemed to come from the abandoned stores. When I'd walk closer to investigate, the sounds would fade away. I mentioned it to Dale, the daytime maintenance guy, and he just laughed. "Old building, weird acoustics," he said. "Sound carries in strange ways, probably just picking up radio chatter from the police scanners or something." That made sense, so I didn't worry about it. But the voices kept getting clearer. I started hearing fragments of conversations about shopping, people discussing prices and sales, children asking their parents for toys. Normal mall sounds, except they were happening at 2 in the morning in a mostly empty building. One night, I decided to test my theory about radio interference. I turned off my walkie-talkie and unplugged the security office radio. The voices continued, clear as day. "Excuse me, do you know where the Radio Shack is? Mommy, can we go to the toy store now? These prices are ridiculous. Let's try the other department store." I was hearing these conversations in perfect detail, as if people were standing right next to me. But every time I turned around, the corridors were empty. The voices weren't the only thing. I started noticing that some of the abandoned storefronts had lights on inside, even though the power had been shut off to those units years ago. Warm, inviting light that spilled out around the edges of the metal security gates. When I'd check my master list, those stores had been vacant for 5, 6, sometimes 10 years. One night, I saw people. I was doing my midnight rounds when I noticed a woman with 2 small children walking toward the old Sears anchor store. She was wearing a bright pink sweater and had that distinctly 80s hairstyle, big and permed and sprayed into place. The kids were dressed like something out of a family sitcom from the same era. I called out to them, asking how they'd gotten into the building, but they didn't respond. They just kept walking, moving at that leisurely pace people have when they're browsing and shopping. I followed them towards Sears, but when I rounded the corner, they were gone. The Sears had been closed for 7 years. I started doing research on the mall's history. What I found made my blood run cold. Millfield Shopping Center had been the site of 3 suicides over the years. All of them involved people jumping from the second-floor balcony into the main concourse below. The first was in 1993, a man named Robert Chen, who had lost his job and was facing bankruptcy. The second was in 2001, a teenage girl named Ashley Morrison, who had been struggling with depression. The third was in 2014, a woman named Linda Graves, who had recently been diagnosed with terminal cancer. But those weren't the only deaths. I found records of heart attacks, strokes, and one case where an elderly man had simply sat down on a bench and never gotten up. The mall had a higher than average mortality rate, which I thought was strange for a shopping center. The more I researched, the more disturbed I became. There were reports of people getting lost in the mall, even though it wasn't that big. Security footage from the daytime hours sometimes showed people walking into stores that didn't exist, or having conversations with people who weren't there. Around my 6th week on the job, things started getting personal. I was sitting in the security office around 3 a.m. when my radio crackled to life. "Security to main concourse. We have a situation near the fountain." The voice sounded like mine, but I hadn't called anything in. I was sitting right there, holding the radio. I checked the frequency. It was set to our normal channel. "Copy that, security." "What's the nature of the situation?" This voice was different, older, gruffer. I didn't recognize it at all. We've got a male subject. Appears to be in distress, requesting backup and possible medical assistance. Copy. Medical en route. I listened to this exchange with growing confusion. There was no backup to call, no medical team on standby. It was just me in the building. But the voices on the radio sounded completely authentic, like a real emergency response. Then I heard something that made my hands shake. Subject identified as Marcus Williams, age 34. Appears to be suffering from psychological distress, possible PTSD episode. They were talking about me, but I was fine, sitting in the office, completely lucid and aware. I wasn't having any kind of episode. Williams has been acting erratically for several weeks, talking about seeing people who aren't there, hearing voices. Tonight he became violent and had to be restrained. Copy that. Psychiatric hold? Affirmative. Transport to County General for evaluation. I turned off the radio with trembling hands. Whatever I was hearing, it wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it sounded so authentic, so detailed, like a real emergency call about a real situation. That's when I started questioning everything. Had I really seen those people in 80s clothing? Had I really heard those conversations about shopping and sales? Or was I having some kind of breakdown, seeing and hearing things that weren't there? I thought about my military service, about the things I'd seen in Afghanistan. PTSD was real, and it could manifest in unexpected ways. Maybe the stress of the divorce, the custody battle, the financial pressure. Maybe it was all catching up to me. But then I found the incident reports. They were filed in a cabinet in the back of the security office, dating back 15 years. Report after report of overnight security guards experiencing anomalous events, voices, lights in empty stores, sightings of people who shouldn't be there. Every single guard who had worked this shift had documented the same phenomena I was experiencing. The reports painted a clear picture. Something was wrong with this place. The building itself seemed to be holding on to the past, replaying moments and conversations and encounters from its more prosperous days. The dead weren't gone. They were still here, still shopping, still trying to live their lives in a place that no longer existed. But the most disturbing report was the most recent one, filed just 2 weeks before I was hired. Subject: final report, security guard position. Date: 2 months ago. Guard: James Patterson. After 6 weeks on this assignment, I am submitting my resignation effective immediately. The anomalous events documented in previous reports have escalated to physical interactions. I have been touched, spoken to directly, and followed by entities I cannot explain. Of particular concern, I have begun to question my own memory and perceptions. Time seems to move differently in this building during overnight hours. I have lost entire hours with no memory of what occurred. Security footage from those periods shows me having conversations with empty air, responding to people who are not visible on camera. Most disturbing, I have started to doubt whether I am still alive. The people I see in this building treat me as one of them, a lost soul trapped in a place that no longer serves its purpose. When I look in mirrors, sometimes I do not see my reflection. I recommend this position be eliminated. No one should work alone in this building during overnight hours. I read that report 3 times, my heart pounding harder with each pass. James Patterson had experienced everything I was going through, but worse, much worse. That's when I decided to test something. I walked to the men's room near the food court and looked in the mirror above the sinks. My reflection stared back at me, tired, unshaven, wearing my security uniform. Normal. But as I watched, my reflection began to change. The uniform faded, replaced by civilian clothes I didn't recognize. My face looked younger, less weathered, and behind me in the mirror, I could see people walking through the corridor, shoppers, families, teenagers hanging out at the food court tables. I spun around. The corridor was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was gone entirely. The mirror showed the bathroom as it was, but I wasn't in it. That's when I understood the truth. I wasn't the security guard. I was one of them. One of the lost souls trapped in the mall, replaying the same routine night after night, unable to accept that the place we were bound to no longer existed. I ran back to the security office and grabbed the employment records from the filing cabinet. I found my own file, my application, and background check and hiring paperwork. But when I looked at the dates, they were all wrong. According to the documents, I had been hired 5 years ago, not 6 weeks. 5 years ago was when I had been found dead in this mall, slumped over in the security office during what everyone assumed was my first week on the job. Heart attack, they said. Stress from the divorce, financial pressure, undiagnosed PTSD. My ex-wife had claimed my body, and my kids had attended my funeral. I remembered that night now. The chest pains that started around 2 a.m. The feeling like someone was sitting on my chest, making it impossible to breathe. I had tried to call for help, but my radio wasn't working. I had tried to walk to the main entrance, but my legs wouldn't carry me. I had died alone in that office, and somehow I had never left. The other security guards who had reported seeing me weren't lying. I was one of the anomalous entities they documented. A dead man who didn't know he was dead, still showing up for work night after night. The people I saw shopping weren't ghosts haunting the mall. They were people like me, souls who had died in this place and couldn't move on, still trying to live their lives in a building that was slowly crumbling around them. We were all trapped together, the living and the dead, unable to distinguish between past and present, memory and reality. I don't know how long I sat in that security office, staring at my own death certificate. Time moves strangely when you're dead, I learned. Minutes can feel like hours, or hours can pass in what seems like seconds. Eventually, I stood up and walked to the main entrance. The glass doors were chained shut from the outside, with a sign that read, "Permanently closed, no trespassing." Through the glass, I could see a parking lot full of weeds and broken asphalt. The mall had been abandoned for months, maybe years. But inside, we were still here, still walking our rounds, still shopping for things we'd never buy, still living lives that had already ended. I understood now why the previous security guard had written that final report. He had figured out the truth, just like I had. But unlike me, he had found a way to leave. I never did. If you're listening to this, it means someone found my recordings in the security office. Maybe they're thinking about taking the night shift position, or maybe they're just curious about what happened to all those guards who quit without notice. Don't take the job. Don't come here at night. This place feeds on isolation and regret, trapping souls who are already lost and can't find their way out. I'm still here, walking the same rounds, checking the same empty stores, watching the same phantoms go through the motions of a life that ended long ago. Sometimes, late at night, I see new faces among the shoppers, people who died recently, who haven't yet realized they're dead. I try to warn them, try to tell them to leave before they get trapped like the rest of us, but they never listen. The dead never listen. I need to tell someone about this before I lose my nerve. What happened at Riverside Elementary changed everything I believed about life and death, about justice and protecting the innocent. I've been carrying this secret for 8 months now, and it's eating me alive. My name is Bobby Martinez, and until last March, I worked as a night janitor at Riverside Elementary School in Millfield, Missouri. It's a small town along the Missouri River, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody. and nothing much happens that doesn't make it into the weekly newspaper. I took the job after the furniture factory closed and laid off half the town. At 45, with a high school education and 20 years of factory experience, I wasn't exactly swimming in opportunities. But the school district needed a night janitor, and I needed steady work with benefits. Riverside Elementary was built in 1952, a solid brick building that had served the community for over 70 years. It had that old-school charm: high ceilings, hardwood floors, tall windows that let in lots of natural light during the day. The kind of school where 3 generations of the same family might have walked the same hallways. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m., Monday through Friday. The work was straightforward: clean classrooms, mop floors, empty trash, maintain the building. I worked alone, which suited me fine. I'd always been a quiet person, more comfortable with my own company than making small talk. The first few weeks went smoothly. I developed a routine, starting with the main office and working my way through the building methodically. Classrooms on the first floor, then the second floor, then the basement where the cafeteria and gymnasium were located. By 5 a.m., everything would be spotless and ready for another day of learning. But Riverside Elementary had a history that I didn't learn about until I'd been working there for almost a month. In 1987, there had been a fire. It started in the basement, in the old boiler room that had since been converted to storage. The fire spread quickly through the building's aging electrical system, and by the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the entire first floor was engulfed. 7 people died that night: 6 children who had been staying after school for a special program, and their teacher, Mrs. Catherine Henderson. The children ranged in age from 6 to 9 years old. Mrs. Henderson was 28, fresh out of college, dedicated to her students. The fire department found them in Mrs. Henderson's classroom. She had tried to get the children to safety, but smoke inhalation overcame them before they could reach the exits. They were discovered huddled together in the corner farthest from the door, Mrs. Henderson's body shielding the children even in death. The school was rebuilt and reopened 2 years later, but the community never really recovered from the tragedy. There was a memorial plaque in the main hallway, listing the names of those who had died. I walked past it every night during my rounds, never giving it much thought until the children started appearing. It began with sounds. Soft footsteps in the hallway above me while I was cleaning the basement. Children's voices drifting down the stairwell, too faint to make out words, but clearly there. At first, I assumed it was sound carrying from outside, kids playing in the neighborhood, or maybe audio from someone's television. But the sounds were always the same number of voices, the same pattern of footsteps, the same faint laughter and conversation. And they only occurred between midnight and 3 a.m., when the entire town was asleep. One night in early February, I decided to investigate. I was mopping the basement hallway when I heard the footsteps overhead. Small feet running, then walking, then stopping abruptly. I set down my mop and climbed the stairs to the first floor. The hallway was empty, lit only by the emergency lighting system. But as I stood there listening, I could hear voices coming from one of the classrooms. Room 108, about halfway down the corridor. I walked toward the sound, my sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. The voices were getting clearer, and I could make out individual conversations. "Mrs. Henderson, when are we going home?" "Soon, sweetie. Your parents will be here to pick you up soon." "I don't feel good. My throat hurts." "I know, honey. Mine does too. But we need to stay calm, okay?" I reached the door to room 108 and pressed my ear against the wood. The voices were definitely coming from inside. A woman's voice that must have been Mrs. Henderson, trying to comfort children who were obviously scared and in distress. "Why is it so hot in here? And why does the air taste funny? I want my mommy." I know you do, baby. I know you all do. But we need to stick together, okay? We need to help each other. I tried the door handle. It was unlocked, which was unusual. I always locked up each classroom after cleaning it. I opened the door slowly and peered inside. The classroom was empty and dark, just as I had left it hours earlier. But the voices continued, as clear as if 7 people were sitting right in front of me. Mrs. Henderson, I can't breathe very good. Try to breathe slowly, Michael. In through your nose, out through your mouth, like we practiced during our meditation time. Are we going to die? There was a long pause before Mrs. Henderson answered, and when she did, her voice was thick with tears. I don't know, sweetie. I don't know. But whatever happens, we're together. We're not alone. I stood in that doorway for 10 minutes, listening to the final moments of 7 people who had died 35 years ago. It was heartbreaking and terrifying and impossible, but it was happening. They were reliving their last hour, trapped in a loop of fear and smoke and desperate hope. When the voices finally faded into silence, I closed the door and stood in the hallway, shaking. I knew what I had heard wasn't possible, but I also knew it had been real. Those children and their teacher were still here, still experiencing their final moments over and over again. The next few weeks were torture. Every night I would hear them, sometimes in room 108, sometimes in other parts of the building. Always the same voices, always the same conversations, always ending in that terrible silence. I started doing research on the fire, reading old newspaper articles and fire department reports. What I learned made the voices even more heartbreaking. The fire had started due to faulty wiring in the basement. The electrical system was old, installed when the building was constructed in 1952, and it had never been properly updated. There had been small electrical fires before, minor incidents that were quickly contained, but never properly investigated. The night of the tragedy, Mrs. Henderson had been supervising an after-school tutoring program for struggling students. The children were there voluntarily, working on reading and math skills with extra help from their dedicated teacher. It was supposed to be a safe place, a chance for these kids to get the support they needed. But when the fire started, the old building became a death trap. Smoke filled the corridors faster than anyone anticipated. The exit routes that seemed clear during fire drills were blocked by heat and toxic fumes. Mrs. Henderson had tried to get her students to safety, but there wasn't enough time. The fire department report was clinical in its description of what they found. 7 bodies in room 108, overcome by smoke inhalation. Mrs. Henderson had been trying to break the window with a chair when she collapsed. The children were clustered together in the corner where the smoke was thinnest, holding hands. Reading those reports, I understood why they were still here. They had died trying to survive, trying to help each other, never accepting that they wouldn't make it home to their families. That kind of desperate hope, that refusal to give up, it leaves an imprint on a place. But the voices weren't just replaying the past. They were trying to tell me something. One night in mid-February, I was cleaning room 108 when I heard Mrs. Henderson's voice, clearer than ever before. "Bobby, you need to check the basement." I dropped my spray bottle and spun around. The room was empty, but her voice had been right behind me, as if she were standing at my shoulder. "Check the basement, Bobby. The same thing is going to happen again." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. She had spoken directly to me, used my name. This wasn't just a replay of the past. This was active communication. "What do you mean?" I whispered to the empty room. "What's going to happen again?" "The wiring. It's the same problem. You have to stop it before more children die." I ran down to the basement, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the light switches. The storage room that had once been the boiler room was in the far corner, behind the cafeteria kitchen. I had cleaned it dozens of times, but I had never really looked at it closely. Now I did. The electrical panel was ancient, installed decades ago, and added to haphazardly over the years. Wires snaked in and out of junction boxes in configurations that looked dangerous even to my untrained eye. Some of the insulation was cracked and peeling, exposing bare copper wire underneath. But what really scared me was the scorch marks on the wall around the main breaker box. Fresh scorch marks that hadn't been there the week before. I took pictures with my phone and went home early that night, too shaken to continue working. The next morning, I called the school principal, Mrs. Davidson, and tried to explain what I had found. "Bobby, I appreciate your concern," she said, "but the electrical system was inspected just last year. Everything is up to code." I pressed harder, explaining about the scorch marks, the dangerous-looking wiring, the way some of the outlets in the building had started flickering recently. But Mrs. Davidson was more concerned about the budget than potential safety issues. Any electrical work would require hiring licensed contractors, and we simply don't have the funds right now. If you see any immediate dangers, document them, and we'll address them in the next fiscal year. The next fiscal year was 8 months away. That night, I returned to work with a heavy heart. I knew something terrible was going to happen, but I didn't know how to stop it. As I entered the building, I could already hear the voices, not just Mrs. Henderson and her students, but other voices too. Adult voices, urgent and frightened. I followed the sound to the main office, where I found the source of the new voices. The answering machine was playing back messages, even though it was unplugged from the wall. "This is Jim Patterson from the fire department. We need to schedule that safety inspection we discussed. Some of the equipment we saw during our last visit raised concerns." "Mrs. Davidson, this is electrical contractor Mike Chen. I wanted to follow up on the estimate we provided for updating the building's wiring. I know it's expensive, but some of what I saw could be dangerous if left unaddressed." School board meeting, February 15th. Motion to postpone electrical upgrades due to budget constraints. Motion carried. The messages painted a clear picture. People had been trying to address the electrical problems for months, but budget concerns kept pushing the work into the future. The same pattern that had led to the 1987 fire was repeating itself. I spent the rest of that night documenting every electrical issue I could find. Outlets that sparked when plugged into, light switches that were warm to the touch, circuit breakers that tripped regularly. I took pictures, wrote detailed reports, created a comprehensive record of the building's electrical problems. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The school board would form a committee, the committee would request more studies, and the studies would get buried under budget concerns. Meanwhile, children attended classes in a building that was becoming more dangerous every day. That's when Mrs. Henderson appeared to me directly. I was cleaning the hallway outside room 108 when I looked up and saw her standing by the memorial plaque. She looked exactly like the pictures I had seen in old school newsletters. Young, kind, with long brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses. She was wearing a blue dress that would have been fashionable in 1987. "They won't listen to you," she said, her voice sad but clear. "They didn't listen to us either when we tried to warn them about the first fire." "What do you mean?" I asked, no longer afraid of talking to empty air. "We knew the building was dangerous. The children complained about shocks from the water fountains, about lights that flickered during storms. I filed reports, requested inspections, begged the administration to take action." Mrs. Henderson moved closer, and I could see through her translucent form to the wall behind. "They said they would look into it. They said safety was their top priority. But there was never enough money, never enough time, never enough urgency until it was too late." "So what can I do?" I asked. "How do I make them listen?" "You can't," she replied, "but you can take direct action. You can prevent the fire before it starts." She led me back down to the basement, pointing out specific electrical hazards I had missed during my earlier inspection. junction boxes that were overloaded, wires that had been spliced improperly, circuit breakers that had been bypassed rather than repaired. "The fire will start here," she said, indicating a tangle of wires behind the water heater. "Next Tuesday night, during the winter storm, the power will fluctuate, the old wiring will overheat, and by morning, this building will be ashes." "Next Tuesday," I said. "That's only 4 days away. 4 days to save the children who will be here for the Valentine's Day party. 4 days to prevent another tragedy." I stared at the dangerous wiring, my mind racing. I could call the fire department, but they would just refer me back to the school administration. I could call the local newspaper, but they would want official statements and documentation that could take weeks to verify. Or I could take matters into my own hands. That weekend, I drove to the hardware store in the next town over and bought everything I needed. Wire nuts, electrical tape, circuit breakers, basic tools. I wasn't a licensed electrician, but I had learned some basic skills during my years at the factory. Monday night, after completing my regular cleaning routine, I went to work on the building's electrical system. I couldn't fix everything. The whole system needed to be replaced, but I could eliminate the most immediate dangers. I rewired the junction box behind the water heater, the one Mrs. Henderson had identified as the source of the coming fire. I replaced the bypassed circuit breakers with proper ones, rated for the current load. I wrapped exposed wires with fresh insulation and secured loose connections. It wasn't professional work, but it was safe work. Good enough to prevent a fire, at least temporarily. As I worked, I could feel Mrs. Henderson and her students watching me. I couldn't see them clearly, but I knew they were there. The temperature in the basement dropped, and I could hear faint whispers of encouragement. "Thank you, Bobby. You're saving them. The children will be safe now." When I finished, just before dawn on Tuesday morning, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over the building. The oppressive atmosphere that had plagued my nights for months seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. Tuesday night brought the winter storm Mrs. Henderson had predicted. Wind howled around the building, ice pelted the windows, and the power flickered on and off throughout the night. But there was no fire. The electrical system held. The building stayed safe. And Wednesday morning brought nothing more dramatic than a few fallen tree branches. I never saw Mrs. Henderson or her students again. The voices stopped. The cold spots disappeared. And room 108 became just another classroom instead of a window into the past. They had found their peace, knowing that their deaths had not been in vain, that they had been able to save other children from the same fate. I quit my job at Riverside Elementary the following week, told them I was moving out of state to be closer to family, which wasn't entirely a lie. I needed to get away from that building, from the memories of those nights when the dead had trusted me with their message. 6 months later, I read in the paper that the school district had finally allocated funds for a complete electrical overhaul at Riverside Elementary. The work was scheduled to begin during summer break, with the building reopening in the fall, with modern, safe electrical systems throughout. The article mentioned that the decision had been prompted by routine maintenance inspections that revealed potential safety concerns. No mention of ghostly warnings or midnight encounters with the victims of a 35-year-old tragedy. But I know the truth. Mrs. Henderson and her students had been trying to warn people for decades, replaying their final moments in hopes that someone would understand the message. When I finally listened, when I took action to protect the living children who walked those same hallways, they were able to rest. Sometimes I wonder how many other tragedies could be prevented if we paid more attention to the voices of the dead. How many warnings go unheeded because we're too rational, too skeptical, too afraid to believe that love and responsibility can transcend death itself. Mrs. Henderson died trying to save her students, and even in death, She never stopped trying to protect children. That kind of dedication, that kind of love, it doesn't just disappear when the heart stops beating. If you work alone at night, in old buildings with long histories, pay attention to the sounds around you. Listen for voices that shouldn't be there. Watch for signs that don't make sense. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. The dead don't always want to scare us. Sometimes they just want to save us. These stories find their way to people for a reason. If you've made it through all 3 confessions, you understand that some truths are too important to keep buried. Thanks for listening. If you made it through the darkness.